would also go at the end of the day, which was drawing to a close very fast. After exiting the balloons, Ash and the others went through the back door of the small building and then out to the front of the shop outside to meet up with the other trainers and Butterfree for the closing of the mating season. They walked out into the open fields which were being bathed in the light of dusk and met up with Officer Jenny and her men. Ash greeted her with a smile and then faltered a little when he felt a weight land on his head and other shoulder not occupied by Pikachu. He looked up and saw the pink Butterfree resting on his head while his own Butterfree had taken perch on his other shoulder, making Ash resemble some time of Pokémon coat rack. He just sighed and shook his head good naturally while his friends and Jenny laughed. He then looked at the female officer after she had finished laughing and addressed her. "How did everything go down here, officer?" The boy asked in good humor. Jenny shared his grin with her own as she answered him, "Everything went just fine, Ash. No more criminals showed up and from the looks of things, the courting rituals went off without a hitch." She made a gesturing motion to the many Butterfree who were now on the ground with their former trainers gathered around them. All of said trainers were displaying looks of happiness for their Butterfree but also ones of sadness. "I don't think the trainers here are looking forward to what's about to happen next though," she observed sadly. Ash knew why this was and nodded. Brock as well, and he spoke on it. "Now comes the part of the Butterfree mating ritual where the Butterfree and their mates take to the sky and start their journey across the sea, making their way towards the mating grounds somewhere in the Orange Islands so they can have their babies. No trainer looks forward to this," he stated with sympathy towards the many trainers and Butterfree who were being forced to part for the sake of nature's cycle to continue on. Salia seemed to appear saddened for a moment but then replaced her morose look with one of acceptance and understanding a second later. She had obviously been preparing for this moment for a long time now and knew what was supposed to happen. She didn't like it naturally but she understood why it had to be done. Ash on the other hand seemed totally neutral towards the upcoming situation though also very sympathetic for the other Butterfree trainers which confused Jenny and Salia but made perfect sense to Ash's friends. They knew all about the ingenious plan he had come up with to avoid the very situation about to take place and he had even talked to Professor Oak earlier in the week to make sure his plan was okay with the famous Pokémon researcher. Quite unsurprisingly, Professor Oak was more than fine with Ash's idea and even commended him on it for thinking of such a well-planned-out idea, stating himself that few things were worse than separating a good trainer from their Pokémon if they truly cared for one another, no matter what the circumstance happened to be. He had even told his young pupil during their long-distance conversation that if he wouldn't have thought up the idea of sending his Butterfree and its mate to the lab when they were ready to have babies, he would made that very same offer to Ash himself just so he wouldn't have to part from his Pokémon. Even though the professor obviously understood why parting of ways had to happen sometimes, just like with the Butterfree mating season, he still didn't like it and knew how potentially unhealthy it was for a trainer and Pokémon. Some would argue and say that it did a trainer and their Pokémon good to know what the pain of separation and going their opposite ways felt like, stating that it helped both of them grow, but Oak disagreed and passed down this belief to Ash. No form of growth or strength was ever worth breaking the bond between trainer and Pokémon, regardless of whatever lesson some of the more hard-ass individuals thought it taught. The love and bond between human and Pokémon was something that transcended any level of power, strength or maturity lesson that could be gained from a trainer releasing their Pokémon. Even if it was something such as training reasons, like letting someone else train your Pokémon for you, which Ash and Oak both thought were completely idiotic to do. Why let someone else train your Pokémon? It is your duty as a trainer to teach your Pokémon all they can possibly know to grow, and if you don't know something then you learn it. Simple as that. It doesn't matter how long it takes or how much of an annoyance it is. You made the decision to capture that Pokémon and you are responsible for their growth. All of them. Not just some. There was also letting Pokémon go for the reason that angered Ash and the professor the most, which was just being unable to deal with them. A Pokémon learns to depend on their trainer and becomes attached to them. Letting one go just because you don't know how to take care of them properly was a disgrace in the eyes of good trainers everywhere. Professor Oak was of the firm belief that it would be best if those same trainers had their Pokémon training license revoked for such actions, and Ash totally agreed. So needless to say, the professor was very proud of his pupil thinking of such an idea for his Butterfree because, as he told Ash, if he wouldn't have thought of it then Oak himself was going to tell Ash about it. He knew how close Ash was to his Pokémon and separating him from any of them would be more of a hindering blow than a helping hand in his growth as a Pokémon trainer. With his thoughts being pushed to the back of his mind for the moment, Ash, his friends, Donnie and Salia started making their way towards the cliffside where all of the Butterfree would take off from. Jenny and the other officers followed after them, wanting to stay until the very end just in case anything were to happen last minute. They reached the cliffs after a few minutes of walking and then stopped, now standing at a safe distance away from the edge so no one would fall off. The male and pink Butterfree stood in front of Ash, looking out over the cliffs side by side with their wings touching. The raven-haired trainer looked out over the sea into the horizon far beyond which was being set ablaze by the setting sun, the likes of which seemed to be hanging just above the water. It truly was a beautiful and tranquil sight that he had a hard time believing was also signaling a time of heartbreak for so many trainers and their Butterfree. He felt a hand on his chest and looked at his side to see Giselle smiling at him. She pulled at his tracksuit and laughed a little. You might have to put some of those sewing skills you said your mom taught you to good use. You're looking a little ragged, sweetie, she told him with a playful wink. Ash just laughed and gave her a mock glare. Yeah, well, let's see you survive an exploding building and then see if your clothes don't get a little torn up, huh? He said with a smile. She laughed as well and held her hands up. Okay. I surrender, you've made your point. Still. She examined his clothes. I could help you stitch these up, you know. Ash looked down at the top and bottom portion of his tracksuit and then nodded after seeing how torn up they were. Yeah, I would appreciate that, he conceded while rubbing the back of his head. You want the pants or top? Giselle giggled. I'll take the top please, she requested politely. He laughed again and pulled her close before looking behind them. The boy could see that the other trainers and Butterfree had finally caught up to them and were now saying their last goodbyes. There were many tearful farewells from both trainer and Butterfree as they all gave their parting words and embraces to their Pokémon. Giselle, Officer Jenny, Misty, Salia and even Ash felt their eyes grow slightly wet at the sight of such bittersweet sorrow. Brock and Donnie had solemn looks on their faces while Pikachu and the two Butterfree also had wet eyes. Well, actually, Pikachu's eyes were only wet, he had yet to allow any tears to fall. However, both Butterfree were starting to outright cry because they knew they would be leaving their trainers soon as well. Ash hadn't told Butterfree about his plans since he wanted it to be a surprise, and because of that, Butterfree was looking up at his trainer with tears flowing freely down his face as his body rocked with the occasional sob. The pink Butterfree also seemed very sad, and not just for her own trainer but Ash as well. She had grown quite attached to him due to everything that had happened, and after being around such a caring, kind and good-hearted person that loved his Pokémon so much, she hated the fact that they had to leave him now. Even though she was very sad, it was still nothing compared to her mate, who seemed like he was about to break from the thought alone of leaving Ash. She fully started to believe that she would actually have to drag him away from Ash forcefully so they could leave with the others and not get left behind. Pikachu looked down at his devastated teammate, whose eyes were now blurry and even puffier than usual with tears, and desperately wanted to comfort him by saying that this wasn't the end and that they were going to remain being a team and family, but it wasn't his place. Ash knew what he was doing and he would trust his trainer. Eventually, all the goodbyes had been said, and at that point, everyone was just lingering. The Butterfree finally started taking to the air with their mates and commenced to flying out over the ocean. Some looked back with tears still in their eyes while others just faced forward, not having the courage to look back without losing their resolve to leave. The trainers were all in various states. Some were waving their Butterfree off, bravely holding back tears, while others just dropped to their knees and released their sorrow in cascades of tears which fell to the ground and dampened the rocks of the cliffside in their salty essence. Others simply walked away, too depressed and upset to linger in such a place of sadness and heartache anymore, vowing silently to themselves that they would never return to the place that separated them from their beloved Butterfree. Salia took a deep breath as the Butterfree finally started to fly away and made to say her own goodbyes to her former Butterfree. However, just before she knelt down, she felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up. She noticed Ash looking down at her with something in his eyes that she couldn't place. The brunette then stood up and looked at him questioningly. What's wrong, Ash? He simply smiled at her and then looked at his friends, who gave him a nod to continue, which he did. He looked back at her afterwards and spoke, Salia. I have a plan in the works that will allow me to avoid releasing my Butterfree and letting him go, he said with complete and utter seriousness. His Butterfree shot his head up immediately upon hearing those words. Salia seemed confused. I'm sorry, Ash, but I don't understand. She responded cluelessly. Ash placed his hands on hips and looked out at the many Butterfree who were starting to make their way across the ocean before continuing. I believe in responsibility when you become a Pokémon trainer, Salia, he began. She looked at him with interest, obviously curious as to what he was getting at. The two Butterfree, Donnie and even Officer Jenny seemed curious as well. He stared at the horizon with a focused expression as he went on. I believe that when you become a trainer, it is your sole duty to ensure not just your Pokémon's growth, health and well-being, but also their happiness and what is the best for them. I learned under Professor Oak for many years and he taught me in that time many important lessons. One such lesson being that even when something comes along that can make your Pokémon happy but cause them heartache in the process, it is your job as a trainer to find some way to take the heartache out of the happy situation. No matter how much stress it causes you. He looked down at his Butterfree, who was looking up at him with tears still in his eyes. I thought about this very situation for a long time, and even though I knew Butterfree finding a mate would bring him much happiness, I realized that him leaving me and all of my other Pokémon who are also his teammates and family, would cause him sadness that I couldn't bear. Also, the thought of releasing any of my Pokémon makes me feel sick, but Butterfree's happiness came first and that's why I came up with this idea. He looked back at Salia, who was now enraptured with what he was saying, as was everyone else. Why do trainers release their Butterfree at the end of the mating season, Salia? And not just because it's natural and so the Butterfree can go to their mating grounds. What is the real reason that would make it impossible for a trainer to allow their Butterfree and its mate to remain with them? He asked. Salia was obviously very smart and well versed in the ways of Butterfree because she didn't have to even think about it before replying, because Butterfree have many babies and it would be impossible for a trainer to take care of so many while on the road. Even if they weren't under the Pokémon League sanctioned rule of only 6 Pokémon being allowed on a trainer's team at any given time. A rule which can only be temporarily lifted by that region's official professor and head of Pokémon research. Ash smiled at her answer and nodded. Correct. Now, here's where I am fortunately an exception to the rule of owning a breeding pair of Butterfree. While I can't take care of a bunch of baby Butterfree and have them with me on the road, I come from a place that can. You see, I'm from Pallet Town. Home of the world-famous Pokémon researcher, Professor Oak. He has a massive Pokémon reserve people call the Oak Ranch, which can house thousands of Pokémon at one time. It's a totally safe, protected and peaceful place where Pokémon belonging to trainers that Professor Oak sponsors can live and, in my Pokémon's case, train with no fear of anything like they would in the wild. Professor Oak takes care of them all like they were his own while they wait to be swapped out by their traveling trainers, and as of right now, his ranch is not even close to reaching its limit on Pokémon. He gestured to both Butterfree down on the ground who were looking up at him with rapt attention. There's more than enough food at the ranch, tons of shelter, really expansive and is even way safer than the Butterfree mating grounds would be since it's still located out in the wild. Professor Oak's lab would be an amazing place, better than any I can think of, for these 2 Butterfree to go and have their babies. They could live around the same area my other Pokémon do since they all stick really close together, and I'm sure they'll even help watch over the babies when they're not training. Besides, Butterfree at the mating grounds only stay with their offspring for a short time before leaving once they grow up. At the lab, these 2 can see their babies all the time unless they decide to leave the ranch once they've grown up. He looked back at Salia, who seemed dumbfounded, and smiled. Professor Oak is in total agreement with my plan, and this way, I can keep my dear friend Butterfree as my Pokémon and he and his mate can have babies in an environment safer than any other. Also, anytime I need him for a battle or something, I can still just call Professor Oak up to get him sent over to me, have the battle and then send him right back. He'll be able to be with his mate, babies and teammates all at the same time and everyone is happy. There's just one thing to this. He looked at Salia seriously. If she would be okay with it, then I'll have to capture your former Butterfree, Salia. Would you be alright with that? Would you trust me with your old Pokémon? If not, I won't do this and I'll let them go to the mating grounds with the rest of the Butterfree. If you are okay with it though, then I can promise you on my life that she'll be safe, strong and happy as she can possibly be, he vowed. Everyone was totally silent as Ash said this, no one breathing a word as they watched Salia intently for her reaction. The young woman seemed to be surprised for a few moments and then looked down at her former Pokémon, who looked equally as stunned by what Ash had just offered. She walked over to her Butterfree and knelt down, looking at her Pokémon intently. Finally, she spoke. Well, Butterfree, what do you think? This is your decision, not mine. I've already released you. Ash just asked me out of respect of being your former trainer, which I really appreciate, but this is your choice, she said with a kind smile. Butterfree looked at her in surprise and Salia continued to smile. I can tell you, personally in my opinion, what I think about it and what I believe you'll get is Ash's Pokémon. She looked up at Ash from where she was kneeling then. Ash, even though we only just met, you've proven to me through your actions today just how much you truly love Pokémon. And not just your own either. She pointed to her Butterfree and then glided that same hand through the air as she motioned to the many other Butterfree that were flying away. You didn't know or owe anything to any of the other Pokémon here today, and when you faced Team Rocket, you could have just rescued your Butterfree and left ours to their own fate. You didn't, and instead, you risked your life for them all. She looked back at him again. From what I've seen from you, I know that you are a great trainer who takes wonderful care of his Pokémon. If I were to put the fate and well-being of my darling Butterfree here in the hands of anyone else, it would without a doubt be you. She smiled warmly at him. I am totally okay you capturing and training my Butterfree Ash. Salia looked down at her former Pokémon again. As Ash's Pokémon, I think you will know a life of not just love, safety and happiness with your mate and babies, but also, a real chance to grow strong. Stronger than you can imagine, she stated honestly. The pink Butterfree looked up at her former trainer and then at Ash. She was still feeling complete and utter shock if she were to be totally honest. Not at the thought of becoming Ash's Pokémon because it seemed terrible, no, that wasn't it at all. Far from it, in fact. What she couldn't believe was how he so freely offered something like that up. To just welcome her into his team of Pokémon, whom he saw as family, with no thought or care. As though he was just willing to accept her with open arms. She also looked at his Pikachu and saw the same inviting expression on his face as well. When Ash had mentioned how she and her new mate could go live where all of his other Pokémon did when they weren't with him, a safe place to have their babies and live in peace. It sounded wonderful to her and she just couldn't believe that he was offering such a thing. After everything he already did for her that day, coming to save her and the other Butterfree from Team Rocket and then going back inside of the burning warehouse to save her, she couldn't believe it. And now, her former trainer was even telling her how great of life she could have being Ash's Pokémon, and plus, that ranch place did sound very nice indeed. On top of it all, she respected Ash greatly. After all, he managed to raise up and train her handsome mate to be how he was today, and that definitely said a lot for him. Becoming stronger also sounded very appealing to her. Ash walked over and knelt down in front of her. Smiling, he asked, "Well, Butterfree, what do you say? Wanna join the family?" She looked at her former trainer, back at Ash, up to Pikachu and then at her other side to her mate, who was smiling in a very encouraging manner at her, and then decided. She first flew up and hugged her former trainer tightly, who seemed to understand the meaning behind it and hugged her former Pokémon to her tightly as well. A few tears escaping her eyes, she did so. "You're going to be so happy," she whispered to the pink Butterfree. The Pokémon disengaged herself from Salia and nodded at her with happy tears in her eyes before she then lunged at Ash and hugged him. Surprising the boy but making him smile all the same. After she had finished hugging him, Ash set her down and then asked kindly, "So Butterfree, is that a yes? Do you want to become my Pokémon?" She nodded eagerly at his question and called out a few times in confirmation, "Free, free. Free." Ash smiled broadly and nodded. "All right then." He reached back into a side pocket on his pack where he kept his empty Pokeballs now and pulled one out. "Welcome to the family, Butterfree." He then gently tapped her head with the ball and it opened instantly, sucking the pink Butterfree inside of its confines and shutting with a resounding click. Since she was already used to Pokeballs and knew what to expect, there was no struggle whatsoever as the ball, dinged, and stars of light burst from it, confirming a successful capture. He took out his Pokédex quickly since he knew what was about to happen and prepared the switch. Being that he already had 6 Pokémon on him, if he didn't send one away then Butterfree would be sent to Professor Oak's. He definitely didn't want that right now and quickly sent back Pidgeot's Pokéball so he could retain his newest Pokémon. Ash smiled at the Pokéball in his hand after the transfer was finished, put the Pokédex away and then called his newest Pokémon back out from the ball. Once she had appeared, her mate jumped at her and hugged her tightly as he officially welcomed her to the family. Ash looked down at his first Butterfree and grinned. Well Butterfree, it seems like you're stuck with me and the rest of the crew. For life. You and your mate could have escaped with the rest of the Butterfree and that would have been it but now. He reached a hand out and gently placed it upon his Pokemon's head. She's part of the family and I'm not giving either of you a chance to get away ever again. Think you can stand me? He asked with a wink. Butterfree let a few more tears slip from his eyes before wiping them away with his wing and then hugging his trainer. Free. He responded with a nod while Ash hugged him back. The boy just smiled and then held his other arm out for the pink one. Well get in here. Your family now, he invited warmly. She smiled and joyfully jumped into her new trainer's arms as he hugged them both. He then stood up after a few moments and released them from the hug, letting the male take a position on the shoulder opposite from Pikachu while the pink female took her perch atop his head. Thank you Ash. Salia said softly as she kissed his cheek. Giselle, not one to be outdone, kissed her boyfriend's lips quickly and smiled at him. Congratulations Ash, she reached up and gently rubbed the pink Butterfree's wing. And welcome to the family Butterfree. I'm happy for you Ash, Brock nodded to him. Me too. Misty said with an even bigger smile. Pikachu pie. Pikachu said enthusiastically as he welcomed the pink Butterfree into the family. Donnie, Officer Jenny and the other officers just remained silent and looked at the scene with their own smiles of varying degrees on their faces. Ash looked out over the cliffs at the several Butterfree who were just now beginning to fade into the horizon and thought about just how ironic the whole thing was. This was supposed to be a time where trainers released their Butterfree and watched on with a mixture of happiness, pride and sadness as their Pokémon flew away over the sea to start a new life. However, here he was with his Butterfree still perched atop his shoulder. Not going anywhere as he watched the rest of his kin disappear into the distance towards their ancestral mating grounds. Not feeling a shred of regret that he wasn't with them, only happy to be with his trainer still. Then, to top it all off and slap tradition in the face, Ash had just added another member into his ever-growing family with yet another Butterfree. A uniquely colored one and his first Butterfree's own mate to make it all the better than it already was. It was safe to say that in that moment, Ash was thanking Arceus in his mind profusely. He felt horrible for the other trainers who did have to release their Butterfree though and said a silent prayer that Arceus would be there for them. All of them as they went through the difficult time of separation and sadness. Even still though, the thought of him standing atop that very same cliff face while his Butterfree flew tearfully away with the pink one was almost unimaginable. Him keeping his head down as tears fell while Pikachu waved goodbye to his friend and teammate while crying himself. Brock, Misty and Giselle feeling nothing but pity and sympathy for him as his Pokémon flew away forever. Ash couldn't even begin to imagine such a horrible scenario and he didn't want to. Maybe in a different dimension from his own it really did happen though. A world where Arceus wasn't constantly watching over him and he was totally different as a person and trainer. Maybe just maybe something like Butterfree being forced to leave him because a less intelligent and prepared version of himself didn't think about the possibilities of Professor Oak's ranch serving as a private breeding ground of sorts for his Butterfree and its mate so they didn't have to leave forever, actually did come to pass. Either way, it made Ash shudder completely and remind himself to pray that much harder to Arceus before bed that night in thanks for everything she was always doing for him and all of the blessings she constantly sent his way. Blessings he knew he wasn't deserving of but for some reason still was bestowed with all the same. Once all of the Butterfree had vanished into the horizon and evening had come with darkness finally beginning to fall, all of the trainers began making their way out of the wide open field sprawling across the high elevation of the cliffside they were on. Leaving the Butterfree cliffs behind them forever as they each went their own separate ways. Donnie clapped his hands, which resounded off of the now silent cliffside, save the waves of the ocean down below, and addressed the small group that was still gathered. Well everyone. Waitia say we all head back to the shop, have some hot tea and soup. Celebrate the passing of yet another Butterfree mating season made possible this year by Ash and his brave Pokémon stopping Team Rocket, and wish all of those Butterfree and trainers good thoughts as they go their separate ways. He walked up and clapped Ash on the back then as he admired the only two remaining Butterfree in the area, who were still perched upon the boy's shoulder and head respectively. I suppose we can also celebrate Ash here getting to keep his Butterfree and adding a new one to his team as well, EHH. He said with a wink and another pat on Ash's back. Then you can all stay upstairs in the guest rooms for the night. How's that sound? He finished jovially. Ash and his friends looked at each other and smiled, agreeing without speaking that it was a good idea. It was getting dark after all, and if they didn't stay with him then it would end up being camping alongside of the road for them. Which Ash didn't mind, but he was exhausted bodily and needed a good rest. Sure Donnie, thank you, he accepted with a slight bow. Donnie waved him off. Think nothing of it. Just as they all started to walk away, Officer Jenny came up to Ash and stopped in front of him. As much as we would really like to celebrate with you all, the others officers and I need to get back to headquarters. Have to be ready for the next call, and I need to get cracking on that description and information you gave me on those 3 crooks from Team Rocket if I'm going to get a massive search and arrest warrant sent out for them. She smiled at Ash brightly. You performed a great service today, Ash, and I thank you again. You and your Pokémon. She then smiled coyly and said quietly, this is off the record just to let you know. My way of saying thank you. The female officer then kissed him on the right cheek and winked at him. You take care, Ash, and remember, if law enforcement ever appeals to you later in life, my branch will be there to take you in once you complete the academy. Ash blushed slightly at Jenny's show of affection in thanks to him, but quickly composed himself. You've got it, Jenny, thanks again for coming when you did, he said gratefully. Brock was meanwhile just standing there with his mouth hanging agape as his arms hung loosely to the sides like a Vigoroth. WHAAAAT. He yelled loudly. Why does Ash get kissed by Officer Jenny but I get nothing? It's not fair. He whined loudly and pitifully. Misty smacked him upside the head. Because you're a dirty pervert who creeps women out, that's why, Brock. She growled. Giselle just shook her head and figured that she should get used to other females thanking Ash in that way whenever he did something heroic. He was handsome for a kid his age, what could she say? She sure as hell didn't blame them. Donnie bowed to Officer Jenny. Thank you as well for all you and your men did, officer. Are you sure I can't interest you in any tea or a room for the night? Space is limited, but it's the least I can do for everything you have all done here today. Jenny just shook her head and politely declined. As much as I do appreciate the offer, we don't have any problems flying through the night, and besides, it's our sworn duty to protect and serve, so there is no need to thank me. Once that was settled, Officer Jenny and her men bid Ash and the others farewell one last time before making their way towards their helicopter some distance away from the cliffs. Ash's friends, plus Donnie and Salia, then started heading back to Donnie's shop for the night. Ash taking a second more to look out at the ocean before he left to follow his friends, wanting to enjoy the peaceful serenity of the moment for just a bit longer. However, just as he began making his way from the cliffside, something or more someone caught his eye and caused him to stop. What he saw that made him go still was a person standing a moderate distance away from his current position while overlooking the ocean, with what also appeared to be to his surprise, Butterfree standing by their side. He took a minute to get as clear of a view of the person as he could, which wasn't easy since it was getting dark, and managed to tell that it was a woman. From what he could see, she looked to be around 18 or possibly 19, had long pink hair that almost appeared to be a shade of red or beige and hung down past her shoulders quite some ways. She wore what he thought was a blue top with lace around the chest, a pair of white jean shorts that had a black belt around the waist, a lone blue glove on her left hand, and knee-high black, low-heeled boots. From what he could see of her, she had a great figure with good curves and very nice legs. The Butterfree beside her looked to be around the same size as the pink Butterfree but smaller than his male one. He looked at the person for a time, who just continued to stare out across the sea, and then heard his friends calling for him. Not wanting to keep them waiting, he tore his gaze away from the mystery woman and followed after the others. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Sometime later, Ash and his friends could be found sitting around a table in Donnie's shop. Piping hot cups of grass whistle tea sitting in front of them with a few bowls of warm rice stew that had a soy, ginger base for the soup itself occupying a space next to each cup of tea. The tea was a special blend that was good for relaxation and the stew was meant to bring clarity and peace at the end of a long day. Both were specialties of Donnie's family and had been passed down through the generations for many years. Surprisingly enough, the tea and soup were quite good. Something that surprised them all since the thought of rice mixed with soy and ginger seemed nasty but really wasn't. Ash apparently loved the tea as he had already had 2 cups and was on his third. They all sat with Ash and his friends near each other while Salia and Donnie sat on the other end together. Though far enough apart so that it wouldn't be awkward. They had been sitting in relative silence for some time while they ate and drank their tea. A companionable quiet that would only broken by the occasional short burst of conversation. Pikachu was sitting on the window sill behind Ash's chair since he was sitting at the very back of the table, and the 2 Butterfree were off somewhere else inside the shop. Ash eventually broke the silence by downing his third cup of tea and started pouring himself another as he looked at Salia. "So Salia, what are you going to do now?" he asked. The young woman thought about it for a little while as she swirled the contents in her teacup around before setting it down and placing her hands in her lap. She then shrugged, "I'm not really sure honestly. I was journeying around for a while after I captured Butterfree as a pink Caterpie and back then I wanted to be a Pokémon trainer and see the world. After a while though, I just kinda saw that it wasn't for me. I'm not really all that thrilled by battling Pokémon and after I captured Butterfree, I didn't really care if I ever caught another Pokémon again. To be honest." She smiled to herself. "I really love just taking care of Pokémon and making sure they're happy and healthy. That's what I focused on all the time with Butterfree. She got as strong as she did by pretty much training herself. I tried on many occasions but I was just no good at it," she finished with a sigh as she drank some more tea. "I just don't know what I want to do." Ash listened intently to her story and swirled his own tea around before an idea suddenly popped into his head. "Hey Salia, you said you love taking care of Pokémon and being there for them, right?" Getting a nod from the woman, he smiled and continued. "Well, how about this little idea? Professor Oak doesn't have any assistants or aides helping him out at the lab besides his granddaughter sometimes, and that's not very often since she's always so busy with her training to become a Pokémon nurse. I helped him out while I was training under him for 5 years but I'm gone on my journey now so I can't do that anymore. You love taking care of Pokémon and I can tell you do a great job at it with how healthy Butterfree looks, so why don't you go and see about becoming the professor's assistant? He's a great man who can teach you a lot and I'm sure he would enjoy having the help just as much as you would enjoy helping out. What do you think?" Salia sat there stunned. Her, an assistant to the Professor Samuel Oak, one of the most revered Pokémon researchers in the entire world, all she could do was just stutter a little in response, Me. Professor Oak's assistant. Ash smiled and nodded his head fiercely. "Yes. Come on Salia, you said yourself that you don't know what you want to do now and you're obviously great at caring for Pokémon. I think it could be your calling," he urged. Salia seemed to think about it for a few moments before she spoke again. "But what about the professor? What if he doesn't like me? What if I mess up or don't take care of the Pokémon right? This is the Oak Pokémon Laboratory we're talking about here. He may not even like me." She fretted almost frantically. Ash just gave her a look and tilted his head to the side. "Really? That's the best you've got, Salia? Come on. You seem like a great person from what I know of you and also seem to have a very kind heart. You love Pokémon and you did an amazing job raising Butterfree, forget the whole battling and training thing. I think Professor Oak would be lucky to have you and would accept you with open arms. Give yourself some more credit. I think you're pretty alright," he complimented with a warm smile. Salia blushed under Ash's praise as Giselle spoke up. "Yes Salia, I would try it. Never know unless you go for it." Misty nodded her agreement. "That's true Salia, you should at least try it to see if it works out or not. Professor Oak is a great guy that I'm sure you would really benefit from learning under Salia," Brock pressed on. Donnie decided to add his 2 cents worth. "I agree with them Ms. Salia, you shouldn't be afraid to take risks and try new thing," he said wisely while sipping his own tea. Salia seemed to still be undecided and Ash chose that moment to bring out the big guns. You know, if you worked at the lab then you could see Butterfree anytime you wanted and even watch their family grow, play with the babies. That was all he managed to get out of his mouth as Salia slammed her hand on the table. I'll do it, she yelled excitedly. Ash smiled widely at her and nodded his head. Good, I'm glad. It'll be nice seeing another friendly face when I go home too, he told her with that same charming smile of his. Which made her blush yet again. 10-year-olds making a woman blush. Arceus, what nonsense had the world come to? Salia regained her composure and then asked another question while looking slightly shy. Would you please call Professor Oak and let him know that I'm coming, Ash? She asked hopefully. The boy smiled charmingly again, yet another blush being received in return, and nodded. Sure thing, I'll call him tomorrow when I report in to tell him about everything that happened today. Don't worry, Salia, Professor Oak will adore you. I know it, he assured her with a thumbs up. Salia nodded her thanks, looking slightly more confident about the whole thing now, and right before anyone could say anything more, a knock sounded at the door. Donnie merely raised an eyebrow curiously as he got up and went to answer it while wondering who could be coming around at such a late hour as it was almost 10 o'clock at night. Ash and his friends looked at each other, silently readying themselves in case of trouble as Donnie opened the door. They heard him greet the newcomer and apparently receive a polite response in return as the man visibly relaxed a bit. Ash remained fully ready himself just in case, but as Donnie shared a short conversation with the stranger, the older man suddenly let out a laugh and welcomed the person inside. Everyone watched anxiously as the person stepped inside, and as soon as they came into view, Ash was instantly shocked. It was the same girl from the cliff that he saw earlier that evening. Apparently he wasn't the only who recognized her either, because Brock suddenly stood up from the table with a look of surprise on his face as he actually called the strange woman by name, Solydod. He exclaimed in disbelief. The woman turned upon hearing her name being called, and as soon as she did, Ash felt like he had been slammed into by a speeding Arcanine. The woman was, for lack of a better word, absolutely gorgeous. His earlier assessment of her beauty when he saw her on the cliffs was almost an insult to this angel of beauty who came walking in out of nowhere. She had a flawless face with breathtaking blue eyes, a drop-dead gorgeous body, hair that looked like fine reddish pink silk, and an incredibly cute nose. Still though, at a mere glance, she seemed to hold herself with the aura of a woman who was both kind, strong, smart and confidant all in one. That was just the first impression he got from her when she turned around and he was able to see into her eyes. Just one glance in her beautiful blue pools for eyes revealed all of that to him, but left so much more a total mystery. The strangest thing for Ash though was the sudden strange burning feeling he got in the pit of his gut when he looked into her eyes. Almost like a fire had been started that was making his entire stomach burn like the core of a fire-type Pokémon. A similar feeling he would get whenever he was around Daisy Oak, only he didn't quite feel like something was trying to burst through his very soul and attach to her own as with Daisy. That would make no sense though, even if he did though, because he didn't even know this woman. The fact that he was feeling so strange deep down all of a sudden had him slightly detach himself from the rest of the table so he could compose himself. The last thing he wanted was to hurt Giselle because she thought he was checking out another woman. Solydod's eyes slightly widened as she saw who called her name, but then shifted to one of happiness and recognition as she saw who it was. Brock! She yelled out excitedly as she ran over to the table and hugged the squinty-eyed teenager, who returned the hug with equal enthusiasm. Ash and his friends looked on in confusion at the scene before them as the two finally separated from their hug and faced each other. Wow, Brock, it's been so long. The woman now known as Solydod said with a bright smile. Her voice was simply beautiful and only caused the strange feeling in Ash's gut to intensify, leading him to practically shutting himself out for the moment so he could get a grip on himself. Brock nodded and smiled back at her. Sure has been a real long time. How are things? He asked. Before she could answer, Misty suddenly spoke up. Not to be rude or anything, but who is this Brock? The two of them turned to look at Misty, finally registering that they were there, as Brock pointed to the woman next him. Sorry guys, I didn't mean to be rude. This is Solydod. We've known each other since we were little and she actually lived really close to my house back in Pewter. She left a few years ago when she decided she wanted to travel and train to become a Pokémon coordinator, he explained. Wow, really? Giselle asked, looking at Solydod. Pokémon coordinator. Awesome. Misty said excitedly. Solydod smiled at them all and waved. Yeah, sorry for not introducing myself to you all first, but I was so excited at seeing Brock again that I just didn't see you. Please forgive me, she requested with a slight bow of her head. Giselle just smiled and waved her off. No problem. My name's Giselle, it's great to see you. And I'm Misty, good to meet you Solydod, Misty greeted her. Salia, a pleasure to meet you, Salia introduced herself with a smile and small wave. Pikachu pie. Pikachu chirped at her. Ash was still locked away in his own little world as he tried to get himself together so he didn't hear what was going on. Solydod I smiled and nodded to them one by one. It's very great to meet you all. I heard when I passed through Pewter City a few weeks ago that Brock had resigned from being gym leader so he could go traveling with some friends and I wondered who it was. Now I know, she said while still smiling. Brock took his seat and invited Solydod to join them, which she did after getting the okay from everyone else, as Misty spoke again. So you knew Brock when you guys were younger huh? She asked curiously. Solydod nodded and then looked over at Brock. We sure did. I was a few years older than him but we were the only kids on our whole street who were close to the same age so we started playing together and our friendship just lasted into our later years. We really became close after Brock's father left and his mom died, leaving him in charge of his brothers and sisters. I helped him out however and whenever I could until I eventually left to start my journey to become a top Pokémon coordinator, which was right around the time he took up the role of the Pewter City gym leader. She smiled at her friend then. I really missed him over the years and I'm really glad we got to meet up here of all places. Giselle smiled coyly. So, were you two ever a couple or have any romantic interest in each other at some point then? She asked with a wink. Solydod and Brock looked at each other for a few moments before they both burst out into laughter. Giselle seemed confused as to what was so funny as the two continued to laugh. What's so funny? She asked in bewilderment, totally lost. The pink-haired woman managed to compose herself enough to talk before Brock was able to. Oh no. No, you see. She threw her arm around Brock's shoulder and pulled him into a lopsided hug. Brock is like my little brother. We became so close over the years that we actually started seeing each other as a brother and sister would. She playfully messed Brock's spiky hair up and laughed as he pulled away to fix it. Yeah, Brock said with a smile as he fixed his hair. Solydod was sort of like a big sister to me over the years just as much as she was a close friend and confidant. I've always been the oldest sibling in my family so having someone like her around who could play that card to me instead really meant a lot to me, he admitted. Solydod playfully punched his arm and winked at him. Plus, you're such a pervert you'd probably scare a woman away on the first date wouldn't you? She said jokingly. Misty and Giselle looked about ready to fall into raucous laughter as Brock sighed and dropped his head, whining like a toddler. Solydod. The woman laughed out loud again as she ruffled Brock's hair once more. Don't worry little brother, I'm just kidding around. While Brock just groaned something about mean older sisters Solydod finally saw Ash, who had been sitting in his seat quietly the whole time, and smiled at him. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name earlier, she said nicely towards him. Ash finally snapped out of his daze after getting a hold of himself again and answered her question. Oh, I'm sorry, I must have been thinking about something and got distracted, I wasn't trying to be rude. My name's Ash, Ash Ketchum. Solydod's eyes widened upon hearing his name. Wait, so you're Ash, Ash Ketchum. He nodded and seemed somewhat confused. Yes. He answered her a little off-wood she seemed so excited at hearing his name. He hadn't done anything important or incredible to his knowledge. She smiled widely at him and put her gloved hand on the table. Then you were the one that chased down Team Rocket today and saved all of the Butterfree, right? She asked hopefully. Brock, Salia, Misty and Giselle all looked at Ash as he just smiled sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head. Yeah that was me. Though it was more my Pokémon than myself. I was just there to do whatever I could, he answered nonchalantly. His friends merely rolled their eyes at his modesty. Solydod seemed taken aback. Didn't do anything. Are you serious? Exclamation mark. You saved dozens of Butterfree from the clutches of an evil organization, risked your life in the process for no thought of safety except for theirs and to top it all off, because of what you did the Butterfree mating season managed to continue on. A whole lot of Butterfree found happiness with their mates today, and a lot of trainers got a sense of fulfillment by seeing their Butterfree find their mates and leave to start a new life across the sea. You did a great deal, Ash. She told him upliftingly. The boy just lightly shrugged his shoulders and took a sip of tea. Well, at any rate, I just wanted to help the Pokémon and I was willing to do anything to do it. I'd do it again in a heartbeat, he said with a smile. Solydod reached across the table and grasped Ash's hands in hers and looked at him with that same smile. Ash, I didn't get a chance to earlier today because I was so happy at being reunited with my Pokémon, and then whenever I finally tried to thank you for what you did, a whole crowd of trainers and Butterfree had already surrounded you and I couldn't even see you, let alone talk to you. I resolved that I would find out who you were afterwards, but then the mating rituals got underway again and everything just continued on afterwards from there. By the end of the day I thought you had already gone and I had missed my chance to thank you, she confessed with remorse. She took a breath and then continued. I brought my own Butterfree here today so she could find a mate, and after Team Rocket showed up and took them all. I was afraid I would never see her again. She was the first Pokémon I ever captured and we've been through so much together. Traveled to all kinds of places, competed in really tough contests, we are very close, and thinking that I had lost her like that. Solydod felt tears start to prickle in her eyes and blinked them away. But then you came along and saved them all, including my Butterfree, and I had never been happier or felt more relieved. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Ash, she confessed as she gripped his hands tighter. Ash just shook his head and returned the grip. No way, Solydod, don't feel like you have to thank me at all. I was only too glad I was able to save all the Butterfree and would do it again at the drop of a hat. I appreciate your gratitude, but there is really no need for it. You're totally welcome, he told her while smiling. Solydod nodded and then released his hands, wiping her eyes quickly of any tears that had collected there as Ash decided to ask a question that was on his mind. Solydod, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I saw you standing on the cliff earlier with your Butterfree beside you and I was just wondering, did something happen? Why didn't she leave with the others? Solydod sighed and leaned back in her chair. Giselle poured her a cup of tea and she took it gratefully from the younger girl, sipping it slowly before she started her explanation. Well, you see, Ash, my Butterfree didn't, well, she didn't find any other Butterfree that she deemed to be worthy enough to become her mate. Ash seemed surprised. Really? There were tons of Butterfree here today though. She nodded and sighed again. Yes, but my Butterfree has always been rather proud of herself. As in, she likes to think she's better than other Pokémon because she's helped me win so many contests and knows that she's strong. I was hoping that there would be a Butterfree here today that could get through to her and impress her, but unfortunately, things didn't happen the way I planned. Or hoped, I guess, is a better word. What do you mean? Giselle asked. Solydod looked down at the table. Well, on one hand what I hoped for did happen. She actually found a Butterfree she was interested in. What was so unfortunate was the fact that he had already found another Butterfree he was interested in, and that female was obviously very interested in him as well. Ash appeared sorry for her. Wow, that really is unfortunate. Who was the Butterfree? Misty asked curiously. Solydod was silent for a few moments but then shifted her gaze to Ash with a sympathetic expression. She pointed at him and said simply, his. Ash's eyes went wide and his mouth dropped open. He closed it after a few moments and tried to fit together what she just said. Mine. He repeated as he pointed to himself. The woman nodded her head regretfully. Yes, Ash, she saw your Butterfree fighting off those other males earlier today and she went starry-eyed. I'd never seen her like that before towards any other Pokémon, so I knew he must have made a great impression on her, despite the rather great age difference between them. She would only be attracted to someone strong, and after seeing him fight those Butterfree and then the unique courting ritual he and that pink Butterfree performed, I was pretty much assured that he was definitely strong. Very strong and well trained too, she said with a smile at Ash, and he just nodded in return but was still frowning slightly. I am so sorry, Solydod. He apologized. I know how hard it must have been on your Butterfree to like mine but then see him courting with another female. Not to mention how let down you must have felt after hoping so much that your Butterfree would find a mate she was interested in, only to get it but then be let down. I'm truly sorry. He looked down towards the table, feeling incredibly guilty for Solydod and her Butterfree. Solydod quickly waved her hands and got Ash's attention again. No Ash, please, don't feel bad in even the slightest bit. That's just the way of things and you couldn't have known about it. My Butterfree just didn't get to him first, that's all. That pink Butterfree was a very impressive Pokémon as well after seeing the way those two flew around the cliffs fighting each other as part of their courtship. I don't want you to feel bad in any way, please. After she realized that your Butterfree was spoken for, she knew she wasn't going to find anyone else, so she joined me in my balloon and we just watched the rest of the mating rituals take place. She laid one of hands over Ash's and smiled at him. I think your Butterfree really made a good impression on her and earned her respect. Especially after everything he did to help you save them all after Team Rocket showed up and captured them. When you saw Butterfree and I standing on the cliffs, we were actually seeing off your Butterfree and his mate. We had hoped to catch a glimpse of them, but I guess they were too far ahead in the flock and we missed them. Seeing she had Ash's total attention, she went on. Even though she was still upset that she lost her chance with him, my Butterfree had a great deal of respect for what he did to save them all, and that's why she wanted to see them off. My Butterfree can be very stubborn and proud, but when she meets a person or Pokémon she respects, she becomes very dedicated to them. So don't feel bad, Ash, you couldn't have helped it. Your Butterfree found happiness with that pink one, which still amazes me because I've never seen a Butterfree that color, but anyway. If anything, Ash, I feel sorry for you. I could tell Butterfree must have had a strong bond with his trainer to become so strong and parting from each other when the rest of the Butterfree left. I can't imagine how terrible you must have felt and probably still feel. She looked slightly ashamed. I feel terrible thinking this way, but I kind of feel like it's better you than me since I dreaded the thought of my Butterfree finding a mate and then leaving. Which was why I felt slightly relieved when she lost her chance with your Butterfree. So you see, if anyone should feel bad, it's me. She admitted. Ash couldn't stand seeing a woman upset and shook his head. No, Solydod, don't think that way. It doesn't make you a terrible person to dread being parted from your Pokémon. It just goes to show how kind-hearted and loving of a trainer you really are with your Pokémon. While I still feel bad that my Butterfree finding another mate meant it caused yours so much heartache, you shouldn't feel bad for me since. He grinned a little sheepishly. I never released my Butterfree. Solydod looked up at him with confusion etched onto her beautiful features. What? Ash nodded his head. Yeah, I never let him go. He and the pink Butterfree never left with the others to go to the mating grounds. Seeing Solydod's still confused face, he called out, Hey Butterfree. Can you two come out here? A few moments later, they all heard the sound of flapping wings and Solydod turned her head just as both of Ash's Butterfree came flying into the room side by side from somewhere else in the shop and landed on either of Ash's shoulders. He smiled at them and rubbed their wings before he looked back at Solydod, who now appeared as though she had 1,000 questions she wanted to ask. The boy just smiled and then went into the long explanation of his plan to keep both Butterfree at Professor Oak's lab so they could have their babies there instead, that way they could still remain with him and not have to go to the Butterfree mating grounds so far away. Solydod meanwhile just sat there in rapt attention as she listened to Ash's ingenious loophole around the usual custom of releasing one's Butterfree during the mating season. The more she listened, the more fascinated she became and the more she realized just how inventive and intelligent of a person Ash really was. Which really impressed her and caused her respect for him to grow. After he was done, Solydod merely shook her head and smiled. Wow, Ash, that's nothing short of amazing. I'm very impressed with how you found a way to still allow your Butterfree to be together and mate, as they're supposed to, but made it in such a way that can still be your Pokémon. Only a phone call away and they can be sent to you by Professor Oak if you need one of them. It's just amazing. I'm very impressed once again, she praised him. Ash smiled at her words. Thanks, Solydod. I'm just grateful that I don't have to say goodbye to these two, he said while still stroking their wings. Solydod suddenly looked a little anxious and fidgeted in her seat as she shyly looked at the pink Butterfree on Ash's left shoulder. Ash, I've never seen a pink Butterfree before, so would you mind if I? She trailed off, her face slightly red, but Ash understood and made a motion at the pink Butterfree to fly over to the woman. The pink female had heard what Solydod said and after getting a nod from her new trainer, she flew from his shoulder and landed in front of Solydod. Free. She greeted the woman with an eye smile. Solydod seemed like a little girl playing with her new favorite doll as she crooned and fawned all over the pink Butterfree while admiring her unusual coloring. Ash, Brock and the others merely looked on with amusement at the seemingly calm and collected woman practically going goo-goo over the pink Butterfree. She's so healthy and her coloring is so vibrant. Solydod admired in awe as she gently stroked Butterfree's left wing. Someone must have really raised her well, she stated with keen observation to Ash. He just shook his head and pointed at Salia. Actually, Butterfree used to be Salia's Pokémon. Solydod looked at the other woman. Really? Salia nodded bashfully and answered her, yes I was. I captured her when she was just a Caterpie and raised her up in the best ways I knew how. I released her today for the mating season, but after she made mates with Ash's Butterfree and he told me about Professor Oak's ranch and how they could have their babies there but still remain under Ash's training, I thought it was a wonderful idea and told him it was okay to capture her. Though he didn't need to ask since I had already released her, but he was just being kind and respectful by doing so, which I really appreciate about him, she said with a shy glance at Ash, who just smiled at her. Giselle tightened her hold on Ash's arm under the table, feeling proud of the fact that she had claim to who was obviously the most popular guy at the table. Poor Brock. Solydod continued to stroke Butterfree's wing.